Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us in the third and final podcast around our theme of shareholder exits and shareholder restructurings. I am Stuart Mullins. I'm a corporate partner at Clarkslegal. I'm joined by Nicky Larkin, the founder of Goringe Accountants and Business Advisory. Hi, Nicky.
Hi, Stuart. Good to see you.
Likewise. Well, Nicky, so by way of a recap, we've had two podcasts in the series so far, and we would encourage you, if you haven't, to have a listen to them. I think when we talk about shareholder disputes, you've got to think a little bit wider as to not just, people falling out, but there's a number of reasons that can give rise to an issue where the exit of a founder and therefore share transfers and value transfers need to be having regarded to. In our second podcast, we talk very much around how you might avoid a shareholder dispute, and that starts right from inception of having a well drafted shareholder agreement in place that can support and deal with and contain blueprints for a number of exits and govern a number of circumstances where there might well be an issue. And today, I think what we're talking about, Nicky, is we're sort of assuming that the parties, if you for want of a better phrase, are through the worst of it. That the issue resulting in a founder or founders leaving has arisen. The shareholders agreement has half worked in the sense that they've gone to the ADR or mediation provision and they've agreed terms, and those terms, for the purposes of this podcast, are that there will be an equity split, and by that I mean that one or two of our disgruntled founders have agreed terms on which they will leave the business, and in consideration for doing so, that they will want to realise value for their shares. They will want the others to buy them out, or the company to purchase those shares. Now, if you've listened to the first of our podcasts, you have heard me talk around valuation methods and compulsory transfer provisions that we can build into shareholders' agreements. One of the things that shareholders' agreements in themselves cannot necessarily deal with is the pot of metaphorical gold that is required to give people for their shares when they do leave. Um, there are certain circumstances where it is possible to insure, such as critical illness and death, but by and large, those remaining shareholders and the company does need to come up with the money to do the deal. So, I think what we'll do, Nicky, is we'll talk about some of the typical exits that we've seen over the years and how they may work. I mean, one of the obvious one is the company's ability to buy back shares, what we call off-market purchases of shares. Now, there's some tight rules and regulations around those, aren't there, Nicky?
Absolutely. So, it's not going to be suitable for all businesses, because what essentially you're trying to do is, one or more of the shareholders' shares are being bought back by the company, but there's got to be sufficient reserves, etc., to do that. So, if you've got a particularly significant valuation, or if your reserves are just very small, that may not be possible, but it is always worthwhile looking if that is a possibility, because it does mean that it saves the other shareholders having to raise funds elsewhere by doing that. But caution, you need to make sure it's done properly. You'll need proper clearances. So you'll do really need to make sure you're engaged with a experienced tax advisor that can put this together and make sure that they get the correct clearances from HMRC.
Thank you, Nicky. I think that's absolutely right. And one of the legal requirements is that the shares must be paid for on day one in full on completion of the transaction. And what that means is that all the money needs to be paid for on the share up for the shares immediately on completion. You can't use loan notes. You can't use vendor or seller finance to get around that problem. There are certain structures that can be implemented that can assist, but by and large, unless there are, as Nicky says, sufficient distributable reserves on day one, a conventional off-market share purchase is generally not an option. Which leads us on to other options, really. One is that the existing shareholders can raise money through their own wealth, through remortgaging or borrowing against their own personal assets, and using that money to buy out the shareholders. And of course, if you were to approach that route, you'd be free to do so on whatever terms you agree with the exiting shareholders. So, for example, you wouldn't need to necessarily pay for all the shares on day one. You could draw that out over a period of time. Now, if you were going to go down that route as a group of founders, you would probably need to offer those exiting shareholders some security, whether that's a charge over property, such as a house, or whether that's a personal guarantee or cross guarantees. In the event that the shares can't be paid for as and when they should be, it gives that seller some protection. Now, in and of itself, where you've had an issue that's forced a separation of shareholders, that's often not necessarily something that founders can agree on, which I then think takes us to some sort of trade exit. Those remaining shareholders to consider whether or not it's time to join forces with a competing or complementary business that can support in that exit. Nicky?
Yes. So the third party sale can work very well. One thing with it, if it's done as a full marketed exit, it will hopefully ensure that the shareholders are maximising the value of that sale. So, which is obviously an upside, and potentially they may be able to push, depending on what their requirements are, they may be able to push to get a lot more of their money on day one. But again, that depends on the quality of the buyer and the quality of the business, of how much would be paid on day one. But the downsides of that are that it's very difficult to manage the timeline of that exit. Typically, if you're being really pushed to a very short turnaround, that can be perceived by the market as more of a stressed exit, or even a distressed exit. So which you don't want to end up leaving any money on the table because of it not looking so good. But typically, depending on the sector, it could be anywhere between 6 months to 2 years. Hopefully, as long as the underlying reasons for the split can be kept under the rug until that point. Hopefully, usually, if they can see that there is that pot of gold at the end of the process, the shareholders hopefully will be willing to keep going until that point. But you just want to make sure that you've got good advisors around you, that it is going to be an exit that actually gets achieved.
I think that's a very good point. If you are going to market and you're in these circumstances, whilst you may have resolved a lot of the issues that have given rise to that particular exit, buyers are, in my experience, quite wary about committing to a process where there could be some leftover
Yeah, I do.
acrimoniousness, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was working on one last year, where there was a very keen buyer, but once he realised, or once they realised, because it was a corporate entity, once that they realised that there was disagreements between the various directors, it was walk away, because who wants to deal with that? So it's
And I think also
got to be very careful.
I think absolutely. I think also the opportunity or the danger of a price chip becomes a very real risk
Yeah.
when they understand that there are desperate reasons to exit certain shareholders. A bargain may well or could be had.
Absolutely.
The other option is, of course, go and talk to your incumbent banks, your institutional investors. It may well be that the performance of the business is such that they may well lend the company money some to facilitate that retirement from the founders. But always worth considering that perhaps some third party PE, VC, or indeed high net support may well also provide an opportunity. I suppose the other area is we've seen a bit of some topical discussion of them of late, given the recent changes in the last budget. Employee ownership, Nicky, may well be an opportunity.
Absolutely, because it may be that, you've got a very solid business, you've got a great team there, but, just because the shareholders aren't getting on anymore, if they step away, the employees may be very happy to take over the business and manage it. And so an EOT may be a very good option for a business. So it's definitely worth considering. As Stuart mentions, there have been changes in the tax. For that, you only get 50% capital gains tax relief now, not 100%, but it still can be a very attractive option. One, because it may give you more certainty on what you get for it, but also, secondly, you've got a bit more control on the time frame of the exit, especially if you're wanting to, go in short term, because you're not having to wait for your buyer to make up their mind, because you'll have your trust set up and you'll be selling to that. So it is a valid choice for some business owners.
Quite, Nicky. I think those that have the appropriate culture, the appropriate mass of founders and key team players to play their respective roles between the corporate trust, the board. It is always worth it exploring as as an option, as you say, not from a tax perspective, not as favourable as it once was, but still very, very, very attractive, appropriate for the right business. Well, Vicky, I think that's a good place to pause today. Thank you for your input today. Thank you for your input over our entire series on shareholder disputes, exits, where and what to do in the event of planning before there is one. And hopefully you've also gleaned some useful information as to what you could do whilst or some routes to solution in the event you do find yourself in an instance where you are looking to have to consider an equity reshuffle, for want of a better phrase. Um, there is plenty of information on our website with articles that talk about various aspects of this. So please do, if you would like further information, don't hesitate to have a look at our library online. And of course, do feel free to reach out to either Nicky or I with any questions, comments, or observations that you may have. In the interim, thank you very much for listening and joining us. We do hope you found these podcasts and this series useful. Until the next time, very much bye for now. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.